9 people walked out of a tent in the middle of the night in -40 degrees and left their shoes behind. All 9 were dead within hours. The northern Ural Mountains in February are not a place that tolerates mistakes. The temperatures fall below -40. The winds come down the slopes with what meteorologists call Katabastic force. Gravity-driven, accelerating, capable of flattening anything not anchored to the ground. There is a section of ridgeline between the Lotsva and Ospaya River valleys where for a few months of the year, almost nothing lives. The local Mansi people called one of the peaks in this region Kholat Syakhl. It means dead mountain. This is where 9 experienced hikers made camp on the evening of February 1st, 1959. The mountain did not disappoint its name. They were students and recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, today called Yekaterinburg. Most were in their early 20s. They studied engineering, physics, radio technology. They were not novices. This was a Category 3 expedition, the highest difficulty classification at the time, and every member of the group had earned their place on it. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, studying radio engineering. He was, by all accounts, meticulous, careful. The kind of person who built his own radio equipment and checked his route twice. The others, and I apologize profusely for this pronunciation, Zenaida Kolmogorova, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonyshenko, Rustem Slobodin, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolvatov, Nikolai Thibew Brignol, and one more, a last-minute addition. Semyon Zolotaryov was 37 years old, a World War II veteran, a sports instructor from a different tour base entirely. None of the others knew him. He had tattoos, which was unusual. He had asked, for reasons never explained, to be called by a different name. Sasha. Short for Alexander, rather than Semyon. He had joined the group at the last moment after being removed from another expedition. He would become, in the decades that followed, a significant source of questions. There was also Yuri Yudin, the 10th member. On January 28th, 5 days into the trek, Yudin's knee gave out. Rheumatism. He turned back. He would be the only one to see his classmates again, and even that is not quite right, because he only saw them in coffins. Yudin spent the rest of his life trying to understand what happened to the 9 people he left behind in those mountains. He died in 2013 without an answer. The group's stated objective was Gora Otorten, a peak roughly 10 days ski from their starting point. The route booked had been approved. The plan was sound. They were to check in on February 12th and return to the village of Vizhai by February 14th, 15th at the latest. On February 1st, navigating through deteriorating weather and reduced visibility, the group drifted off course. Instead of ascending toward Otorten, they had veered west onto the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. Dyatlov made a judgment call. Rather than lose the altitude they'd climbed, they would camp on the slope and correct course in the morning. They leveled a platform in the snow, pitched their tent, ate dinner, and presumably went to sleep. The last photograph recovered from one of the group's cameras shows them setting up camp in the late afternoon. The slope, the snow, 9 people making what appears to be a routine decision. That image is the last record of anyone in the group doing something ordinary. When February 20th passed without a telegram from Dyatlov, the sports club at UPI began to worry. A search was organized. On February 26th, a student named Mikhail Zaravin, part of the first search party to search the area, spotted something dark against the snow on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. The tent. It was standing, or partly standing. The north-facing side had collapsed under a load of snow. What appeared to be human weight had pressed down on it from outside. But the more significant detail was on the inside. The tent had been cut open, not torn, from the interior, through the canvas wall. Multiple cuts. Someone, or several people, had needed to exit the tent so urgently that they had used a knife on the fabric rather than unzip the entrance, which was, as far as investigators could determine, unobstructed. The belongings were still inside. The food, the boots, most of the warm clothing, a flask of vodka untouched. And leading away from the tent in the snow, heading down slope towards the tree line roughly 1.5 kilometers away, footprints. 8 or 9 sets of them. The prints suggested socks or bare feet or a single boot. The prints were evenly spaced. They were not running. On February 27th, 2 bodies were found at the edge of the tree line beneath a large cedar. They were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. They were dressed in underwear and socks. The branches of the cedar above them had been broken off up to a height of approximately 5 meters. Someone had climbed it, apparently looking for the tent in the dark. There were remains of a small fire nearby. Krivonishenko had third-degree burns on his hands. His knuckles showed bite marks. He had, at some point, bitten his own hand hard enough to remove flesh. The cause of death was recorded as hypothermia. Between the cedar and the tent, over the following days, 3 more bodies were found. Rustem Slobodin, Zenaida Kolmogorova, and Igor Dyatlov himself. Their positions in the snow indicated they had been moving upslope, back towards the tent. Dyatlov was found face up, hands raised towards his chest, jacket unbuttoned. Kolmogorova had a bruise on her side, oblong, consistent with the shape of a baton. Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, small, likely non-fatal, the examiner said, though the confidence with which they said it would later be questioned. All 5, hypothermia. The case appeared to be, if unusual in its circumstances, at least comprehensible in its outcome. A group of hikers, something frightened them out of their tent in the night. They couldn't make it back. Tragic, but explainable, until the snow melted. On May 4th, a Mansi hunter named Kurikov and his dog followed a trail of cut branches through the snow into a ravine approximately 75 meters deeper into the forest from the cedar tree. Under 4 meters of snow, he found the last 4 members of the group. Alexander Kolvatov, Nikolai Thibew-Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, Ludmila Dubinina. They were better dressed than the others. Dubinina was wearing Krivonishenko's trousers, buried and torn, taken from a man who had already died. Some of the clothing had been cut, as if forcibly removed and redistributed. The 4 had clearly survived the others, had organized themselves, had gathered what resources they could from the dead. Then, the autopsies. Thibew-Brignol had a skull fracture so severe that fragments of bone had entered his brain. The examiner noted the deformation extended to multiple bones of the skull. Zolotaryov had 5 broken ribs and what was described as a flail chest. when so many ribs break that the chest wall moves independently from the rest of the rib cage. His eyes were missing from their sockets. Dubinina had broken ribs on both sides, 7 on the left and 4 on the right, and a hemorrhage into the right atrium of her heart. Her eyes were also missing. Her nose was flattened. Her tongue was gone, not damaged, gone, along with the muscles of the floor of her mouth. The medical examiner's assessment of the force required to produce those injuries comparable to a car crash. The injuries to Zolotaryov and Dubinina were, the examiner noted, similar in direction and magnitude despite the two individuals being of different heights and builds, suggesting whatever struck them simultaneously or from the same source. No external soft tissue wounds were observed. The crushing was internal. The Soviet investigator in charge of the case was a prosecutor named Lev Ivanov. He had the files, he had the autopsies, he had the photographs. He reviewed all of it and concluded in May of 1959 that the group had died due to a compelling natural force. The case was closed, files were classified. The area was restricted for 3 years. Ivanov went home with his conclusion. 31 years later, in 1990, Ivanov published an article. In it, he admitted that his investigation had no rational explanation for what happened. He also stated that during the search period, his team had reported seeing flying spheres in the sky over the mountains, and that he had received direct orders from senior regional officials to suppress information from that record. He died in 1999 and never elaborated further. When the Soviet Union fell and the files became accessible in the early 1990s, researchers discovered that parts of the case record were missing. Not damaged, missing. Which sections and why remains unspecified. What was included in the record included radiation finding. Several items of clothing from the ravine bodies tested positive for beta radiation. 3 pieces at levels that would have exceeded safety limits for workers at nuclear facilities. Krivonyshenko, one of the first to die, had been an engineer at Mayak Nuclear Complex, site of the 1957 Kyashtim disaster, a nuclear accident the Soviet government had classified and not yet publicly acknowledged. This had been offered as an explanation for trace contamination, residual exposure from his work transferred to clothing. It had also been offered as something else. There were also multiple witness reports from other groups in the region around the same period describing glowing orange or fiery spheres in the sky. A meteorology student some 50 miles away reported seeing lights moving north to south and then changing direction. Changing direction is not something a meteor does. It is also, the record notes, not something a conventional aircraft of the era did easily at altitude. The Baikonur Cosmodrome, the Soviet Union's primary launch facility, had a flight corridor that passed directly over the northern Urals. Soviet rocket tests were neither announced nor acknowledged at the time. What was in the sky that night is not established. What the file says and what was in the sky are not necessarily the same thing. The record contains approximately 75 documented theories for Dyatlov Pass incident. This is not unusual for a case with no survivors and a 26-day gap between the incident and the first investigation. That gap, in the conditions of a northern Ural winter, erased a great deal. The theories deserve at least a brief accounting, not because they are all equally credible, but because each one is responding to a real gap in the evidence. The Mansi attack theory held that indigenous people of the region, whose sacred lands included Kholat, Syakhl, had killed the group for trespassing. It was investigated in 1959. The Mansi were interrogated. There were no footprints in the snow other than those of the 9 hikers. There was no evidence of a struggle. The injuries were inconsistent with any weapon a Mansi hunting party would have used. The theory did not survive contact with evidence. The military experiment theory covers a range of variations. The route sat along a corridor used for Soviet missile and weapons tests. The radiation on the clothing, the sealed and missing files, the spheres in the sky, the proximity Bianconer, and to the Kishtim contamination zone. The theory does not produce a specific mechanism, but it does account for why the Soviet state may have had reasons beyond incompetence to close a case quickly and restrict the area. The KGB Operation Theory, developed most thoroughly by researcher Alexei Rakitin, proposes that Zolotaryov, Kolvatov, Krivonyshenko were operating as KGB assets, using the expedition as cover to make contact with foreign intelligence agents. The radioactive clothing was to be handed over as disinformation material, fake evidence of Soviet nuclear capabilities. The meeting in this version went wrong. The Americans identified the double cross. What followed was not a natural force. This theory fits several anomalies. Zolotaryov's age and military background, his last-minute addition to the group, his use of an alias, his camera, which was positioned such that it may have been used to photograph others. Krivonyshenko's connection to Mayak, Kolvatov's background in nuclear physics, the radiation on specific garments not distributed randomly but concentrated on certain pieces, the injuries that a forensic examiner said could not have been produced by one human striking another, but which also cannot be cleanly attributed to any natural phenomenon identified at the scene. Rakitin's theory has not been confirmed. It also has not been convincingly refuted. The Infrasound Theory, proposed by writer Donny Icar, suggests that wind passing over the ridgeline at Kholat Syakhl could, under specific conditions, generate infrasound, low-frequency vibration below the threshold of human hearing. Infrasound at certain frequencies is documented to cause disorientation, panic, and a sensation of dread in test subjects. This could explain why 9 experienced mountaineers fled a tent in the middle of the night in -40 degrees without their shoes. It does not explain the internal injuries in the ravine. The Katabastic wind theory, proposed by Swedish-Russian expedition in 2019, argues that a sudden and violent downslope wind, a Katabastic event, struck the tent and made it impossible to remain inside. Katabastic winds are implicated in a 1978 incident at Inaris Mountain in Sweden, in which 8 hikers died under broadly similar circumstances. The topography is reportedly comparable. This theory accounts for the urgency of the exit. It does not account for the ravine injuries or the radiation. And then there is the theory that became, in 2020, the official position of the Russian state. In 2015, the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, a federal body distinct from the regional prosecutors who handled the case back in 1959, began a formal review of the original investigation. The review was conducted at the request of the victims' families. It ran until 2019. The ICRF investigators included, among others, an experienced alpinist, someone who had made more than 25 ascents across multiple mountain ranges. They obtained the original case materials, reviewed the evidence, and went to the site. Their conclusions, issued in 2019 and formally announced by Deputy Prosecutor Andrei Kuryakov in July 2020, were as follows.
The weather on the night of February 1st was severe. Wind speeds approaching 20 to 30 meters per second, described as hurricane force. The temperature was consistent with -40 or below. Conditions that night on the slope of Kholat Syakhl were, by the ICRF's assessment, among the most dangerous possible. The hikers had made a cut in the snow slope to level a platform for their tent. This was standard practice. The slope above the tent was, in the ICRF's evaluation, capable of producing a snow slab event, a slab avalanche, where a cohesive plate of compressed snow breaks from the layer beneath it and slides as a unit rather than as loose granules. The ICRF concluded that a slab avalanche, or possibly the direct structural impact of the Katabastic wind on the tent, had forced the group out. The investigators noted that everything the group did after leaving the tent was consistent with correct emergency mountaineering procedure. They evacuated to ground safe from avalanche. They built a fire. They constructed a snow den. They redistributed clothing from the dead to those still alive.
The ICRF also made a pointed observation. The factors contributing to the tragedy included the group leader's inexperience, or misjudgment, in selecting a campsite on an exposed slope in these conditions. They characterized the negligence of the 1959 investigators as a major source of the enduring mystery, because that investigation had been incomplete, poorly documented, and had generated more questions than it answered. The official cause of death, as announced by Kyryakov, avalanche-related exposure and hypothermia. The families rejected this conclusion. The Dyatlov Foundation rejected it. Researchers who had spent years with the case noted the 4 persistent problems with the avalanche hypothesis that the ICRF had not scientifically resolved. The slope angle at the campsite was below the typical threshold for avalanche events. Search parties arriving 26 days after the incident found no evidence of avalanche debris. The injuries to the ravine bodies were not consistent with those typically produced by snow impact, and the footprints in the snow leading away from the tent showed no sign of panic. They walked. In 2021, 2 Swiss researchers, Johann Guame, head of the Snow Avalanche Simulation Laboratory at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, and Alexander Puzrin, a geotechnical engineer at ETH Zurich, published a paper in Communications, Earth and Environment that attempted to provide the mathematical framework the ICRF had not supplied. Their model showed that if Katabastic winds had deposited snow uphill from the tent during the night, gradually, not all at once, the weight would have accumulated until between 7.5 and 13.5 hours after the slope cut was made. A slab release became mechanically possible. A small slab, not a large one, compact, stiff, sliding across a body in the dark at speed. Their simulations indicated this could produce chest and skull injuries consistent with those found in the ravine. Guame and Puzrin were careful about what they were claiming. Their paper states explicitly that they do not address the radioactivity or the behavior of the group after leaving the tent or the missing soft tissue. Their conclusion is measured. The avalanche theory is plausible. They added plausibility. They did not add certainty. One outside expert, commenting in New Scientist, said the slab would have had to be moving fast and be unusually stiff to produce those injuries, and that the research doesn't explain why, after being hit by an avalanche, experienced mountaineers would flee further into the cold without their clothing. His assessment? For people to do that, they must have been terrified by something. What that something was is not in the paper. In March 2026, a Russian newsletter published a new theory from researchers Vadim Skibinsky and Vladislav Karelin. Karelin is not merely a researcher. He was a searcher in 1959, one of the people who went into the mountains while the investigation was still active. He is now in his 90s. He remembers, he says, seeing a fireball in the sky around the time of the incident, an object that moved from south to north, then changed direction, east to west. Skibinsky and Karelin's theories proposes that the failed launch of an R-12 liquid-fueled ballistic missile, the Soviet Union was actively testing the R-12 during this period, released a cloud of nitric acid propellant over the area. Nitric acid at concentration causes respiratory distress, disorientation, intense pain on contact with skin, and mucous membranes. A fog of it descending on a tent in the dark would explain an immediate panicked exit without time to dress. It might explain the soft tissue damage. It might explain the melted snow patterns around the campsite that some researchers have noted. The theory is recent. It has not been peer-reviewed as of this writing. Karelin's account of a trajectory-changing aerial object is consistent with witness reports from 1959, and also consistent with the behavior of a rocket in the process of failing. Whether those two observations are the same event or different events is not established. The researchers intend to continue. The historical records of Soviet missile tests from the relevant period are not fully declassified. Some of them may not exist in any accessible archive. Others may have been filled in sections of the 1959 case record that are, as previously noted, missing. The mountain pass was renamed after Igor Dyatlov in 1963 by a hiker who had tried to put up funeral notices and been reprimanded by the state for doing so. There is a museum in Yekaterinburg. There is a monument on the slope. The last surviving member of the expedition, Yuri Yudin, the one who turned back, visited the museum in his later years and said almost nothing to journalists about what he believed. He donated his diaries and died of heart failure in 2013. In 2019, Zolotaryov's grave was exhumed for DNA analysis. The results, when published, suggested that the man buried in the grave was not Semyon Zolotaryov. The DNA did not match the expected familial markers. Who was in that grave remains, as of the time of this record, unresolved. The footprints in the snow led away from the tent at walking pace. 9 people, not running, going somewhere or going away from something. They separated into groups, 2 at the fire, 3 on the slope, 4 in the ravine, and each group made rational decisions for as long as they were capable of making decisions. Fire, the snow den, the redistribution of clothing. None of it worked. An official investigation spanning 60 years and 3 distinct governmental bodies has concluded that a rare type of snow slab event in severe wind conditions caused an experienced group to flee a tent and die of hypothermia in the dark. This may be correct. It does not account for the radiation. It does not account for the trajectory-changing object in the sky. It does not account for the injuries the examiner compared to a car crash, produced with no external wounds, no bruising from any recognizable weapon, no evidence of any other party on the slope. It does not account for whose body was placed in Zolotaryov's grave. The record notes the deaths of 9 people on the slope of Kholat Syakhl in the northern Ural Mountains on or around February 1st, 1959. The record notes the cause of death. The record does not explain it.